Hello and welcome to session 2 of our conversations around virtual teams and projects. We have Bob with us, kindly joining us today to talk about culture and beyond. So, Bob, what do you think about culture and its challenges that are imposed on virtual and international projects?
Well, as I said in the first session, the first time we talked, I have a little bit of a complex relationship with the term culture. When I first started in my career as a trainer, business coach, I used the word culture a lot, and it was a very useful and powerful way of making sense of the differences that I experienced around me. But I guess over time, I'm less sure than I was in life generally, but also around whether what I'm experiencing is somehow cultural, if it's somehow personality, or it's just somehow to do with the unique situation. So I sometimes have a strange relationship with the word culture, but I think you've also traveled. I mean, what do you think? Do you think culture is a useful term to make sense of our world?
I think, to be honest from my own experience of living and working in Japan, I've noticed that culture does play a significant role in communication and in working with people, in understanding people and understanding how things work in a different country or in a different organization, which obviously is influenced by the national culture of that country. Now, probably it's not the dominant factor. I mean, I think it is still important to build trust and the care and the trust that we talked about in session 1 probably dominates effective communication and effective teamwork and collaboration more than culture. But I think being aware of culture does make a huge difference, so that you don't misinterpret certain situations or say or do something which might offend someone from that particular culture, whether it's something you say verbally or non-verbal communication, gestures, for instance. So just having some idea of an awareness of the various cultures, I think makes a difference. And for myself, like I've made I've done a few things, for instance, that may not have been looked at in a positive way while I was in Japan. Like certain things like kind of sticking your chopsticks in rice is considered extremely rude. um, and the reverse is also true. Like sometimes, I've observed people behaving a certain way and thinking, "Well, that's very rude," but it's actually considered a polite gesture in their own country, like slurping noodles loudly in a noodle bar, for instance. So
Yeah,
it does play a role, but I think just having some awareness of the national culture of the country you're working with helps to avoid miscommunication and misinterpretation.
yeah. I think what's interesting is you're talking about national culture. You're not talking about individuals. And I think that's very important. That when you use the word culture and look at terms which describe cultures, you avoid believing that all those terms relate to all the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
It describes an average individual, which in fact doesn't exist, and every individual will be unique. It's very important to keep that distinction, I think. And secondly, I think what I found useful personally is the awareness that reading about culture gives you. It's precisely what you said, that a lot of the things that you think are polite and that you mean as polite could easily come across to others in an unexpectedly rude way, in ways that are quite unpredictable. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had a very good example in York Associates once meeting a participant. I'll always remember it because it was a very kind of powerful experience. Monday morning, new participants arrive for training, and I always go in and do my meet and greet and try and make people feel welcome, which is important as an owner of the business. And I entered the room and I saw one lady sitting down, and I kind of knew that she was the Swedish lady, not just because she was blonde, but because she was the only lady on the list, so she had to be from Sweden. So I went over to her and sat down, and I said, "So how are you? Is it your first time in England? Is it your first week? Is you going to stay here for 2 weeks?" I asked her lots of questions, and she was just saying yes, no, yes, no. So I said to her, "You seem a little bit quiet today." And she paused and looked at me and said, "Yes, you seem a little bit noisy." Which was a very kind of sharp reminder that not everywhere in the world do people appreciate or expect that politeness means being asked lots of questions. Politeness in some parts of the world means you leave people alone, and silence is the best mode of behavior. And I've always remembered that, and that kind of awareness that everything you're seeing may be intended positively, despite the fact that it looks, for you at first sight, confusing and even rude. That's very useful to carry around.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And as you mentioned, it is kind of important to identify just those little factors that in certain cultures, certain behaviors are seen as good or bad. And at the end of the day, I mean, we're going back to what we talked about. You might really care about the person, and by asking those questions, you're showing interest. But it's interpreted in a very different way because of the national cultures, which again, as you mentioned, every individual is unique, and it's not just about the national cultures, but the personality, which also ties in, and so that the personality and experiences also tie into that conglomerate of an individual's mindset or software of the mind.
Absolutely. Yes, and not only between culture and personality, we have another very powerful construct, and that's the role that somebody performs in their organization. Mm-hmm. And very often, I often say this, that when we're meeting people, we're seldom meeting a culture, we're seldom meeting a personality. In business, we're generally meeting a role. If somebody is in front of us, they're generally either a sales and marketing professional, or they work in purchasing, or they work in finance, or they work in IT, or they're a production engineer. And what we're seeing and meeting and hearing is all that professional expertise poured through in the desire to be as successful as possible. And it's not really them as a person. They might be quite different outside the workplace. I think that's really important to bear in mind, that a lot of the time we're meeting functional cultures, and often the conflicts that arise are due to the differences in professional or functional culture. Mm-hmm. The R&D, research and development people, do not generally think in the same way as salespeople. IT and finance are quite different to HR, and a lot of the conflicts I see are really at that level. I'm sure you even see that in your own university in some way. Absolutely.
And I'd like to expand on that, Bob, because the role that people play generates these expectations as well, of not just themselves, of feeling that they're expected to behave in a certain way, which is again generated by those around them, feeling that that someone who's a salesperson has to behave in a certain way, someone who's an engineer needs to behave in a certain way. So it's almost it could also be conflicting with their personality and culture in some way. So the complexity of this is that the context, the role, and the responsibilities, expectations, personality, culture, all of these are basically interacting and competing in various environments for people, and affecting people's behavior. So it is interesting to see that culture is one element, but then there's the role, the responsibility, the profession, the personality, and various other factors affecting an individual's behavior.
Yeah, and I think there is a response to that. One of the responses we talked about is not to trust your own perceptions of other people too much. if people are confusing you or irritating you, or you think they're being rude to you, they might not be. They might just be being professional or positive in their own way. And secondly, because we spend so much time in role, maybe it's useful to get creative with that and to break some of the assumptions about our roles, act in a different way, see what happens, or even discuss the assumptions that we're bringing to the role with the person in front of us in order that we can break down those assumptions and get to a meaningful relationship, which sounds very, very obvious, but it very rarely happens. I mean, you like me, we stand in front of people as lecturers, as trainers. How often do we stand in front of a very silent audience who don't say very much to us? And then I often challenge that, and then I get the response, well, you're the lecturer, you talk, we're here to listen. And of course, that's an assumption about role which very few lecturers or trainers want, and it can produce conflict between an audience and a speaker.
Yeah.
And then I'd say to the audience, look, if you wanted to be really smart, when you came into the room, you should have come up to me and said, how do you want me to behave as an audience? What are your expectations of my role? And actually discussed role. If you'd done that, you would have been not just a victim of culture, you would have been a cultural architect.
Absolutely. That's really important, what you mentioned just now, Bob. And it goes back to the power of inquiry. And we talked about the ways of how you ask why, and the curiosity and challenge are the positive ways, and the critical why is obviously a destructive way of asking why. But I think 2 points that you mentioned is one is when we do see someone behaving a certain way that we might not like, they may not be intending to be that way. So again, that curiosity and challenge. In this case, I guess curiosity of maybe going and trying to explore, is it a cultural factor? Is it something else that might be causing that behavior? So that attitude of curiosity would help in that regard. And also what you mentioned at towards the end, if going and asking people, how would you like me to be for you to be at your best? If it's a manager or if it's a trainer, saying, okay, how would you like me to behave as an audience? These questions are really important, and they're very underutilized by people, just inquiring about how you can help them be at their best. And they do the same for us, asking how can they behave in, or support us to be at our best.
And the curious thing is why these obvious questions aren't asked. And that raises some uncomfortable reflections about the nature of the human being, that we may not be as open, as willing to explore, or as flexible to change as we like to believe we are. And I think the sad truth is that a lot of interculturalists and personality experts are looking to drive quite basic levels of flexibility into people, which often isn't there. And I think that's a reality, that people's behaviours, although we don't, the curious thing was when we sit inside ourselves, we don't perceive ourselves as fixed, as inflexible, as intolerant, and as impatient. But somehow the sad truth may be that there are those dimensions inside of us which are limiting us, but we don't see them. And that's quite a difficult process of awareness building, which I guess we're both in the business of doing. Absolutely.
And I think that touches on being aware of that and developing that self-awareness. But I think it's also going back to culture. I think there is a cultural element to it, and there is a habitual element to it. When we don't have a habit of doing certain things, we just don't do it. We just don't feel comfortable doing it. So the habit of not being able to go and ask, we might even think that, oh, this is a good idea, but because it's not a habit, we just don't perform that. And that habit combined with culture, for instance, in our culture, people just don't do that, or this is just not normal. So kind of that expectation, that culture plays with the habits that we already have formed, and provides this resistance for us to behave in more constructive ways, I feel. I mean, I think I'd like to have a kind of a more positive, or a bit of a hope that we can change it if we really want to.
Well, I think if change has to happen, it has to be doable. It has to be makeable into habits. And I think because we're talking very often about people working in teams and in virtual teams, I think there are a number of areas that they need to ask questions about, or they will struggle in their team. And if they make assumptions about these areas, there's likely to be conflict because there are very differently held views. For example, leadership. I think all teams will experience leadership, whether it's in the form of a leader or a cluster of individuals. Now, what's interesting is that very few teams really explore the meaning of leadership and the style of leadership which individuals prefer or the demands of the situation require, so that you often enter a situation where a more controlling type of leader, an expert-driven leader who likes the detail, who's spent his or her whole life managing detail, tries to lead somebody who wants to be empowered in the wrong way, simply because they haven't really had a question about expectations of leadership. And it's very simple questions, I think, can really unlock the power of teams.
Absolutely, and especially for the leaders, whether they're leading virtually or otherwise, because they influence and affect large numbers of people, depending on how many people they affect. I think it's more crucial for leaders to inquire more than probably team members. I mean, of course, team members should also inquire, what makes their team members work, at their best and how they can support each other. But I think leaders often make a lot of assumptions about what motivates their teams and what, how they work and how they should work and all that, and they impose their views and their beliefs and their styles onto others. And unfortunately, a lot of times, this provides a very ineffective team. In fact, I have seen, situations where if the leader was not there at all, the team would be thriving. And for their mere existence is actually causing the team to perform poorly. So
it's called helicopter leadership. You arrive, create a disturbance, and then you fly away.
That's exactly right. So these are kind of really important factors for leaders to be aware of.
Just to jump in, you said it's the responsibility of the leader. That's true. I think to a degree I agree with that. But, we can't expect leaders to be superheroes. Those who are appointed leaders are often there because they're the expert, the most senior knowledge expert in the organization. They're not necessarily naturally talented at leading people. They may need support. They may need a degree of compassion. It's actually relatively easy if the team is not performing to blame the leader. I try to inculcate a sense of leadership responsibility in all the team members. And look, if the guy at the top isn't doing it, maybe he can't do it, and maybe you're better placed to do that. So sometimes leaders need a degree of compassion.
Absolutely. No, I 100% agree with that, Bob, actually. And I think if a team is to be effective, they have to not play the blame game, whether it's other team members or the leader. It's almost like, the way I tell my students is, a team is like a whole body. Like, just think of yourself as members of the same body, and, your hand is not fighting with your feet, and your left foot is not trying to go somewhere else and your right foot going, because you can't get anywhere if everyone tries to do their own thing and they're not cooperating. And I think what you mentioned is absolutely true, is to have that degree of compassion towards others who may not be behaving in the most constructive way, and how can we actually take responsibility in supporting them to develop those skills or be better. But actually, and the key is communication, isn't it? It's like not standing back and saying, "Oh, that person or that leader is supposed to be more supportive or autonomous supportive," rather than just going and saying, "Can I have a conversation with you? This is actually the best way I can work. If you want me to be my most productive, then perhaps if you could give me a bit of space, and I'll be more productive." And many team members actually feel that it's obviously uncomfortable or confronting, and there is a cultural element again to it, that they don't have that communication with their boss. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. Firstly, I think the nature of working in a virtual team makes those kind of offline discussions more difficult. If you bump into somebody in the corridor, I can just say to you, "Can we go and have lunch together? I'd like to have a discussion." All of that gets lost, and virtual teams tend to be in contact when they have to transact a task, and there's no time for all of that offline discussion. And I think that's one of the reasons they struggle. So that means if you are working in a virtual team, take time for one-to-one offline discussions, not to talk about the job, but to talk about feelings and relationships, and just embed that into your working month on a regular basis. Secondly, on the hierarchical issue, I think that's right. There are clearly high power distance cultures, low power distance cultures. It's easier to approach a leader in some places than in other places. And yeah, with high power distance, that kind of almost egalitarian democratic discussion is near impossible, in fact. So that's and that means kind of poor leadership can have more serious consequences, I think, in that context.
Absolutely. Very good points. The first one you mentioned is actually embedding a sort of conversation virtually, which is just connecting with people, seeing how they're doing. Now, do you think these formal and informal conversations should be scheduled or as needed, or what's the best way to have these kind of conversations virtually?
Well, curiously, I knew one guy in Zurich who was a Brazilian, and he was leading a virtual team, and he used to have every Friday morning a virtual cup of coffee, and that basically meant he would invite his colleagues to I think a video conference where he would sit with a cup of coffee, and he expected his other team members to be there just to chat about nothing. Great idea, but people were too busy.
Oh, really? So it didn't actually work?
No, unfortunately, it didn't. And that is the problem, that people generally relegate these kinds of tasks in favour of more hardcore tasks. And again, I think that's a key to working virtually. You need to balance, and sometimes you need to invest time up front in the relationships in order to get the higher quality tasks delivered later. It's slightly counterintuitive, but I think there's a weight of experience that indicates that's the case.
That's probably a personality and a culture as well. Certain cultures are saying, look, we just want to get the work done. And it's not that they don't care about the other person. They just feel like, that they need to be productive and so on. An element of it might be personality. So these are kind of really interesting challenges, because even if there is trust and there is care, then there are all these personality and cultural challenges that individuals face when working virtually or globally, internationally.
I think there's another factor which is often not talked about, and that's the environmental factor of how successful the company is. Mm-hmm. When I see it in a couple of my clients, which are very, very successful, that people don't really need to pay attention to the rules of good leadership and good teamwork. They can basically do whatever they want because the company is going to make money, and there's no reason why anybody would sanction their behavior or would discipline them. The problem comes when the company begins to lose money. And of course, at that point, people are so wedded to their bad habits that it becomes difficult to change them. And they have so much history with employees, things that they've done badly that people are unwilling to forgive them. and that makes the change process almost impossible. So I think it's very, very important to keep a medium and long-term view about this, and to think, is what I'm doing really a sustainably intelligent thing? Because it's easy to act in the short term, but sustainable behavior requires a slightly different mindset, I think.
Absolutely. And just touching on that sustainability issue, I think most people don't think the long term. I guess in some cultures, maybe Eastern cultures, a long-term view is probably a more natural way of thinking, but potentially in individualistic cultures, it's just about short-term gain, and unfortunately, and the sustainability element of, it takes many dimensions, whether it's leadership, sustainable leadership, and developing individuals in the team so that they don't heavily rely on a leader, for instance. Knowledge, how knowledge is imparted, I guess, in a virtual team, so that if a key member of the virtual team is gone tomorrow, then everything falls apart because that knowledge hasn't been disseminated to the key people. So that these are all, I guess, part of sustainability. Would you say these are also part of sustainability, the knowledge and the behavior?
It's absolutely. Sustainability is a tricky word, though, because in the mature capitalist economies of the West, the business models of so many of the organizations are under pressure that they're not confident that they're sustainable within the next 2 or 3 years, and that's breeding or cultivating a kind of short-termism right up to the most senior levels at board level. People stay 2 or 3 years and then they jump, and even at younger age, younger people are expecting now 7, 8, 9 jobs in their careers. It's not so easy to use that word sustainability, and in the developing economies, people, of course, are really looking to accelerate their career by staying in jobs 6 to 12 months before moving on to the next promotion. So everywhere across the globe, sustainability, kind of long-term commitment to people, to sustainable foundations for a business, it's quite difficult to make that case.
Absolutely. So, it is a complex issue when it comes to sustainable models, sustainable practices. But I guess I think the topic, Bob, we're exploring is quite complex, and it's probably worth dedicating another session to this.
Well, just to jump in, I like the word complexity, because at the end of the day, a lot of people simplify their international experiences, and they say the problem is culture, the problem is virtual, the problem is because he's an idiot. The truth is likely to be much, much, much more complex than that, and generally we're part of the problem. And I think just acknowledging that it's complex and that we're part of that complexity can sometimes act to de-escalate the emotion, and just can help us to re-engage and maybe solve the problem.
Absolutely, and I what you mentioned just now, that we are part of the problem, is completely spot on, because we are part of the problem. We are part of that complexity, and it is not just because it's virtual or because it's culture. It has all these dimensions that anyone who wants to be effective has to consider all of these dimensions, and we kind of covered pretty much a lot of those dimensions.
I'm still working today in my environment. I've been working in this field now for 15 years, and I still find it extremely difficult to diagnose what I'm meeting on a daily basis, whether it's personality or culture or company context. I'm operating usually with the tip of such a complex iceberg. Most of the conclusions I'm making are either false or useless. So it's just, you're trying to inch your knowledge forward very, very carefully and sensibly, and try to make smart decisions on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And but I'd just like to mention that the attitude that you just mentioned, Bob, of being very curious and open, and also um, being open to I guess not noticing that your assumptions may be false. I think if everyone who's working in an international context or any context really, if they have this attitude that I could actually be wrong and I could be part of the problem, we will have much more successful projects and teams, and locally and globally, because that is so much key and de-escalates, as you mentioned, like emotions, and it helps us to communicate more effectively and to kind of build those relationships, and which result in more high chance of project success. So I think that is key. What that just you're embodying the right kind of attitude that all team members, all leaders should have for success.
Well, I take it from some of my clients. I always remember one client in Switzerland, a very senior insurance professional, in front of 30 or 40 peers. He kind of stood up and said it was his experience that expertise was his greatest handicap, which is a very curious thing to say. It's not, again, it's counterintuitive. We kind of have the assumption that expertise helps you to do things faster and better, which on the one hand it does, but of course as we face the future and as we're working in a project which is unique, never been done before, faced with new circumstances, expertise can help you, but it can seriously disable you. And it can really lead you to project past experience onto a unique future situation with terrible consequences. So we need to use our experience, but use it very wisely, and just maintain a certain humility that we may be wrong even when we think we're right.
Absolutely, and the choice of words at the end was really fantastic, Bob, because it just kind of brought me back to the notion of the yin and yang, and there is no good and bad. It's just these two opposing things, and we need to hold those in harmony within us. That expertise is good, but it also has its shortcomings. Understanding culture and it is important, but also looking at similarities and those looking at differences and similarities at the same time. And I think those bringing the dichotomies together is quite powerful. And so perhaps we can leave the audience with that notion of the Janusian thinking that you may be aware of, and resume this conversation about culture and beyond for the next time.
Yeah, and maybe take it back into some. What if we kind of accept that? What does that mean on a daily basis? How do we conduct our meetings differently? How do we write our emails differently? How do we live our daily working lives differently? If we accept that, I think we need to translate it into action, into daily habits, as you said before.
Absolutely. Now, so just extending that. So, if there are three things that one can do, perhaps if you look at one which is an attitude or a mindset, one that could be a behavioral factor, and one that could be a habitual factor, what would those be? So let's look at mindset. So mindset of openness and curiosity and compassion, would that be a kind of a good mindset to start with, to kind of be able to write better emails, communicate virtually more effectively, lead teams more effectively?
What are your thoughts? But how do we live? I mean, the problem with human beings is they love to believe they're open, but in fact they're generally not. So if you want to live openness, it would mean when people say things that you disagree with, don't argue with them. Mm-hmm. Investigate why they think what they think. That's a very simple application of openness. Mm-hmm. And if you apply that consistently, and you have to be very honest with yourself, how many times do you realize that what the person was saying was actually smart, and you didn't see it the first time?
Yeah.
The more you do that, the more your whole approach to yourself and other people changes. But to begin, you've got to begin by, rather than saying yes but, start saying, okay, that sounds a little bit strange, but tell me more, and just allow yourself to learn.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that's the element of openness. And And also another, I think, element that is really important that might precede openness is care. And I think you need to care to be open. And I tell my students, if you want to communicate effectively, you have to first care to communicate effectively. If you want to listen more attentively, you have to first have that genuine care for people. So should we kind of include that element of care and developing a kind of a level of compassion and care for others so that we can actually be more open and curious about why they behave in a certain way?
Yeah, on a daily basis, how do we express care? Quite simply, at least once a day, and make sure this is on your to-do list. Offer somebody support without them asking for it, and just get into that habit of offering what we call unsolicited, unasked for support to show a caring attitude in a professional context. And I think that can become inspirational in terms of the culture around you.
Mm-hmm. So that's the element of care and offering support. Any other tips or tricks that we can embed in our daily routines so that we can be more effective?
I think what I said before. I think it's very important to begin to track when you thought the wrong thing, or when you argued for a decision which in fact proved to be false. I mean, this is something I've done personally. I don't think I read about it. I just decided to do it as a matter of curiosity, just to begin to track how often I said something which subsequently proved to be wrong, or tried to argue for something in a meeting that was right, or somebody said something I thought was wrong and in fact it turned out to be a good idea. And what's shocking is you realize that it's not just 5 or 10%. An awful lot of the time, we're arguing from the wrong position. We believe it's a truth, but it's just a historical perspective. And I think we have to evidence this. Once you evidence it, and you can see in black and white that you are regularly saying the wrong thing, that again changes your mindset, changes your behavior, it changes your attitude to other people fundamentally. But you need to start documenting it. So it's a slightly strange tip, but start noting down how often you're wrong, and see how often it happens.
Yeah, fantastic. No, these are great tips. So thank you very much, Bob. And so we will resume in the next session and talk about potentially the same topic, because it is complex. So we may need to also look into groupthink and a few other things that we didn't really touch on. So, but again, thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
Yeah, looking forward to our next virtual dialogue.
Likewise. Thank you, Bob, and have a great day.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.